Hello, fellow filmlings. This is your co-host, Jonathan Satchel. I can't believe I actually get to record one of these. It only took 62 episodes. But this is just a little disclaimer that we had some technical difficulties this week with Alex's audio file. So around the 35-minute mark, you will maybe notice that he's cutting and jumping around a bit. I tried to salvage as much as I could that was still intelligible, so just a little heads up that the audio near the end of the episode will be a little wonky. Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 62, Mounting Mockumentaries.
Right. So many M words. It's great. We have done a documentaries episode, and so of course it's fitting that eventually we tackle the spin-off genre of documentaries, mockumentaries, which has become really popular in the past decade or so. 2 decades, actually, I think I have to say. Yeah. Especially when we talk about TV shows like The Office and Parks and Rec. Even getting to this point where in Parks and Rec, I don't think they even explain that it is a documentary at any point, even though the characters seem very aware of it throughout the film.
Yeah, it's just kind of implied, and then you have all the looks at camera and stuff like that, which is one of the great things about mockumentaries is that you can do things like breaking the fourth wall and stuff like that, and kind of taking all of the tropes that we talked about in our documentary episode, all of these established things that go back to the 30s that make documentaries what they are, and then you just kind of put little spins on them and have some fun with them. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we do, just a little bit of history. I think in the documentary episode we covered a little bit of this, but if we throw back to a very old episode of ours and talk about surrealist director Louis Buñuel, he actually created this quote-unquote documentary called Las Herdes, or in English, Land Without Bread, in 1933. And in this documentary, he kind of subverts the idea of a travel documentary where he goes to this very poor area of Spain, and he has this narration throughout the documentary showing these people and the way that they live and all this kind of stuff. And the narration kind of contradicts what you're actually seeing in the picture. And so it sets some people off because it's done completely straight-faced. And so it looks like a real documentary, but it's got a lot of kind of subtle jabs at the format of documentary and stuff like that. And then another fun one that I found out about this week is that apparently the BBC sometime in the 50s ran a news segment about how in Switzerland they would grow spaghetti on trees and pick it and serve it. And then a lot of people, apparently spaghetti wasn't a big dish in England at the time. And so people were literally calling the BBC and asking how they could plant their own spaghetti trees. I'm going to find a link to that video and put it in the notes because that's just kind of a lot of fun. And apparently it's infamous as one of the best pranks that a reputable news source has ever pulled, like on their actual information channel. So
wait, Jonathan, are you saying that spaghetti doesn't grow on trees?
I'm not saying that. You got to watch the documentary.
Oh, okay. My bad. Because that's what I grew up with, so that's what I'm sticking to.
Spaghetti trees. Yep. But what are we talking about this week, Alex?
Well, we're going to be talking about a series of mockumentaries kind of evenly spaced across the last 30, 40 years, starting with 1984's This Is Spinal Tap, which kind of kicked off like this big modern era of mockumentaries. And it was Rob Reiner's feature directorial debut. He had done a couple movies before, or a couple TV movies before this, and he had done... of course, he was famous for his sitcom roles, but this is his directorial debut where he kind of makes a big splash in the industry, which earned him the carte blanche to go ahead and make The Princess Bride, which is a lot of people's all-time favorite film. I love it. I know you love it.
Yeah.
And it was The Princess Bride had been this movie that was like stuck in production hell for years and years and years, and nobody was allowed to do it. But Rob Reiner did such a good job with This Is Spinal Tap that they allowed him to go ahead and make The Princess Bride because they thought he was up to it. So This Is Spinal Tap definitely merits a looking at to see not only its mockumentary qualities, but also what Rob Reiner did with it to make him seem so worthwhile to tackle the big project that was The Princess Bride.
Yeah, and the influence of Spinal Tap comes in a lot of directions. First of all, just cementing this idea of mockumentaries, but also just in Rob Reiner's interaction with his stars, because one of the stars of This Is Spinal Tap goes on to create several mockumentaries, including our next movie called Best in Show, directed by Christopher Guest, who plays Nigel in This Is Spinal Tap. Best in Show came out in 2000, and it's a mockumentary about a dog show and all the people and crazy personalities that go into that behind the scenes.
And our final film of the week is going to be What We Do in the Shadows, very recently from 2014, directed by Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement of The Flying Condors. Is it The Flying Condors? I feel like I just murdered that.
Flight of the Conchords.
Oh my gosh, I'm awful. Okay. From Flight of the Conchords fame. So we're going to take a look at that. And of course, Taika Waititi just made a big splash in popular culture with his Thor movie, which everybody loved, or seemed to love at least. I'm not here to judge. Actually, we are here to judge a little bit. That's kind of what we do. But
not that movie today.
It will be fascinating to take a look at one of his films from before he became part of the MCU.
Apparently, making a good mockumentary is a good calling card to get lots of big offers afterwards.
Yeah, it's enjoyable. It's a lovable genre for sure. So without further ado, let's dive into the films in depth.
All right, so we're starting off with This Is Spinal Tap from 1984, very well known. Basically, it is a Rob Reiner actually appears in the film, and he starts off saying his name is Marty DeBurgi. He's a filmmaker who saw this band and had to make a film about them because they were just so exceptional and so interesting. So we follow him through a series of interviews that he does with the band members, and also footage of their concerts. The band is called Spinal Tap, and it's this just ridiculous. In theory, it's a British band who's doing an American tour, and they had done a tour like 15 years ago and were huge, but this tour we just kind of follow them on this slow descent through all of these mishaps and cancellations and all this stuff, and we're really just kind of following these characters and this character dynamic inside of what is really the I guess commentary of the film in a loose way about the hypermasculinity of 60s and 70s rock music, because there is so much suggestiveness, explicit and implicit, throughout the entire film, like in the band's lyrics and the way that they interact with other characters and stuff like that. But yeah, we just kind of follow all these characters, and it's all put in this kind of mix of cinema verite and interview style documentary, and it really like comes off like a documentary and like a lot of music documentaries that had been done up to that point, to the point where some people who saw the film thought that it was a real documentary and were confused why someone would make a documentary about a band that nobody's ever heard of and that was really terrible.
Oh man, it's funny because just last week we were talking about how Orson Welles tricked a bunch of people. So
yeah, it's a good segue.
It's a good segue, and maybe it was planned, but I don't know. Was it planned, Jonathan?
Not really. No, not really.
Yeah, there's a lot of happy accidents in filmmaking and in making podcasts about film. But yeah, and of course we should point out that this is the first Rob Reiner Christopher Guest collab. Rob Reiner and Christopher Guest both standbys in the world of mockumentary. And, of course, they would work together again on The Princess Bride.
Christopher Guest playing Count Rugen, the man with six fingers,
Right.
in that movie, and Rob Reiner directing.
Right. It's a wonderful collab, a wonderful partnership, and we get to see it start here. And I like that Rob Reiner has put himself on screen in this film, so that not only do we have him as a imaginary director, we also have him as the real director, which is just kind of mind-bendingly meta. And
it's really
enjoyable.
funny that he gives himself a fictional character to play named Marty DeBurgi, which in an article that I read about this a long time ago when I took a documentary class, is a book called Documenting the Documentary. But anyway, apparently the name Marty DeBurgi is kind of a parody of Martin Scorsese, who had directed a music documentary called The Last Waltz, which is actually alluded to in this film. At the wrap party for the tour, an interviewer asks the lead singer of the band if this is the band's last waltz, and so it kind of throws that out there. There are a lot of like really subtle parodies of real bands and stuff like that. There's Beatles influence. There's Metallica
the old
and
video.
Ozzy Osbourne. Yeah. There's just like almost exactly Beatles setup. It's crazy.
Yeah. There's a and to get specific, the old video we're talking about is when they refer to the earliest, kind of one of the earliest performances of of Spinal Tap. They show them as in black and white. They've got the Beatles hairdos from the early 60s, and then they performing a very kind of like early rock doo-wop-ish kind of song that then they show like their Sgt. Pepper phase where they're all hippied out later on, and they kind of track them that way. Also, real quick, Jonathan, did you know that originally Rob Reiner was supposed to be part of the band, but that it was decided that he shouldn't be part of the band because he wouldn't look very good in spandex?
That's funny.
And that's a decision that Rob
sense.
Reiner was a part of and basically made himself, because as the director, he probably had the power to put himself into the band if he really wanted to, but he decided not to do that, and I respect him for that.
Yeah, I think that all the actors that they got for the band were just perfect, and the insane hair and mustaches and costumes that they put them in are just so perfectly over the top, but almost not given real bands from the time that this movie is parodying.
Yeah, right. Like rock kind of inherited this rebel status where they had to keep pushing the envelope and going outside of the norm farther and farther to a point where it almost felt like a parody of itself. And this is very much a parody of itself. And real quick, not to backtrack again on you, Jonathan. I'm sorry I'm doing this. I should have been a little more alert. But I just wanted to point out that another little Spielberg parody is the fact that Rob Reiner's director is wearing like a Navy hat, like a Navy, like a baseball cap with a Navy ship on it, except it's not a real Navy ship. It's like the USS Uri or something like that. Ural Sea instead of the USS Coral Sea.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so there's a lot of like little touches, and it's all done so well. Like, and one of the reasons that the movie feels so much like an actual documentary is that most of it is improvised. So all the characters kind of had an idea of where each scene was going, but I don't think there was an actual script, and so they would just kind of have this situation like, okay, we're gonna put these elements all together, but all the actors are just improvising it, which makes it feel very raw, and they're so into their characters that it all just kind of comes together really well. And even I think he actually got a cinematographer from who had documentary background just to give it that real documentary feel, and he's kind of following people around, not knowing exactly what they're going to do. So it all goes into this very cinema verite feel that we talked about in our documentaries episode.
Certainly. And of course, we've come kind of full circle from, or I shouldn't say full circle, let's say 180 degrees around the circle from our Alfred Hitchcock series at the beginning of this season,
Right.
who planned out everything to the last detail. This is, this style of filmmaking that we're talking about now is about getting a bunch of talented people in the same room and then making it up nearly completely on the fly. But that's what makes it work, and it's what makes those little tiny funny moments that become really funny just really click over the course of the film. And it makes it feel really, really creative and almost completely thoroughly planned out in this weird way. Like, how could they come up with so many gags on the fly?
Oh my gosh, it's so funny. Yeah. And speaking of kind of 180 degrees, the fact that this movie starts out as a mockumentary about this fake band, but then Spinal Tap kind of becomes a real band after the movie, and they go on tour, they go on night shows in character, they go on tour and do the whole rock band thing, and they even did a reunion tour and made another kind of semi-sequel to the movie to promote that. I can't remember what the reunion tour is called, something ridiculous like Breaks in the Wind or something like that. Yeah, so it kind of, this fake thing turned into kind of a real thing, and it's kind of this funny dichotomy that happened after the movie was made because it became so popular.
Now, if only somebody made a documentary about how the fake thing became a real thing.
Yeah, then we just get all the layers.
Let's keep going deeper.
Yeah, but like I said, there's some great parodies of other movies like A Hard Day's Night, obviously with the Beatles. There are some scenes that kind of mimic Don't Look Back, which is the Bob Dylan documentary, where in the Bob Dylan documentary he kind of goes through this like basement area. It's kind of mazy to get on stage, and in Spinal Tap there's a scene where they're kind of in this basement area trying to get on stage, but they just keep going in circles because they're so lost, and they're trying to get directions and they can't figure out where the stage is. And that is really the appeal of the movie, is the contradiction between the fact that the band is trying to exude this aura and personality of power and virility and masculinity, yet everything that they do fails utterly and just comes out looking totally pathetic. And the fact that they're trying so hard to not look that way just makes it so funny. There's so many examples, but like the Stonehenge is a pretty good one, where they're trying to come up with a set for one of their numbers about Stonehenge that's got this like dark and mystical feel to it about the Druids and who built Stonehenge, and this huge set of Stonehenge is supposed to come down. But when Nigel is drawing the picture on a napkin really quickly, he puts 2 apostrophes by the 18 instead of 1, and so they get an 18-inch Stonehenge instead of an 18-foot Stonehenge, and they don't even know it until it shows up on stage, and the singer looks at it and he just like has this look on his face like, oh my gosh, what have we done? And they just look so ridiculous.
Yeah, there's very much this sense. Part of the humor of the film is that the band is just winging this. They have no idea what they're doing over the course of this tour. And the people making the movie about the band are also winging it, except they do have an idea of what they're doing. So the theme of how it's made and the theme of what's happening within the film kind of match, which is nice, and I think is part of what makes the movie work so well.
Yeah. And this idea that all of this like power and masculinity and everything that this band is trying to portray is really just a facade and kind of a show, and that shows up a lot of times throughout the film where they're saying one thing but then the reality is very different, and the cucumber gag kind of embodies that as well.
Is that the cucumber in the pants?
Yeah, right. The bassist is going through this metal detector and he keeps setting it off and he keeps taking like keys and change and stuff out of his pocket until finally the security guard, who's who's checking him, who is a woman, which is kind of important, makes him take this cucumber that he has wrapped in foil out of his pants. And because they're so just like, they're so obsessed with their masculinity and this whole idea that there's this culture that they've built around themselves, but it's all just fake, and that's just shown over and over and over again.
Oh yeah, no, totally. Everything about them is fake to a degree. They just living into this idea of themselves, and the film is about exploring how fake that idea is, and maybe how fake the idea of real bands are. But it doesn't matter in the end because we love them all anyway. And
yeah, and it kind of skirts this line between parody and satire, which are almost synonymous, but not in the fact that parody can make fun of something while also being almost an homage to it, or like having reverence for its subject. And satire almost always has a derisive tone to it, and this movie kind of rides that line between homaging bands and satirizing them. And it's really interesting because, you know, we see all these things, they keep getting beat down and beat down and beat down, and then by the end, when they get back together and they kind of have this last hurrah, we feel good about it, even though they're kind of all of these terrible people who have this toxic relationship with each other.
Right, exactly. All right, and so on to our next film of the day, Best in Show from 2000. It's always such a weird year to say. Anyway, Best in Show is a Christopher Guest movie. And at this point, Christopher Guest had already kind of established himself as a mockumentary filmmaker with stuff like Waiting for Guffman. And this is like his third or fourth feature film. So it's not a debut in any sense of the word, any sense of his career, but it is one of his best performing, the best remembered mockumentary films. And it certainly is a good example to take a look at. If for no other reason than the structure, which instead of following a collected group of people over a road trip or a tour, like in This is Spinal Tap, covers really an event and then a bunch of different crazy characters at the event. And the event in question is the Mayflower Kennel Club Dog Show, and we see the experiences of all of these different characters over the course of the film. And they are all completely absurd. And this is to a certain extent, this film kind of works off of the same principle that This is Spinal Tap does, in that it makes fun of people who take dog shows seriously. But I feel like it really gets its comedy from going outside of making fun of the familiar to just making everything seem really, really absurd and really, really far out there. And the sets of characters that we follow are pretty funny to see. First up, we have Jerry and Cookie Fleck, who are hilarious. There's like this browbeaten husband and a
with two left feet,
literally with two left feet, played by Eugene Levy, and his wife, played by Catherine O'Hara, who has has her husband completely whipped, and two, sleeps around, and they, like, over the course of the film, they keep bumping into the different men who she slept around with. And they have...
presumably all in the past.
Presumably, but we don't know for sure. And, of course, they have their dog that they have entered into competition, who's this little Norwich Terrier named Winky. And then we have Meg and Hamilton Swan, who are this super uptight, like, stereotypical yuppie couple. And they have I can never say this dog breed's name. I apologize. A Weimaraner. Anyway, it's essentially like a streamlined greyhound that they've taken very good care of, but they're also very strict with the dog, and the dog has gone crazy or not crazy, but has started acting very neurotically after walking in on the couple being intimate with each other. And they take the dog to a therapist. They try to they try to resolve that. They also have a lot of conflicts with each other, and they just yell at each other the entire movie, and they're clearly super uptight, and it's just hilarious to watch them as they struggle over what seems like something that's pretty banal by comparison. Like, it's not
everything they fight about is petty. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, it's really funny. And then of course we have the one single contestant who is played by Christopher Guest himself, Harlan Pepper, in his Bloodhound Hubert. Harlan is like this outdoorsy owner of a fishing goods store out in the middle of nowhere. He's also an aspiring ventriloquist, which is kind of creepy, but whatever.
Yeah, it's a funny touch for, it's kind of random for his character.
His character is all sorts of random. His character very much feels like Christopher Guest went out into the woods with a cameraman and a bloodhound and just ad-lib stuff, and that's what we got. I mean, like, the dude is just really proud of his ability to name nuts, like find and name nuts that he finds. He has their whole family has a long history, a long line of raising really, really good bloodhounds. So they kind of have a tradition of excellent breeding, and he wants to live up to that. But I very much feel like in this context, this character is kind of like an outlet for Christopher Guest, because he doesn't play into the story as much as the rest of the characters.
But he is one of the more memorable ones just because of his accent and his whole character.
Oh yeah, he goes way out there. His character is just there to be way out there, but it works. It works because the whole movie is about being way out there. And of course, we have Sherry Ann and Leslie Ward Cabot, who have the champion poodle. So this is the champion to be dethroned, played by Rhapsody, or it's a standard poodle named Rhapsody in White. And this is one of them is like a trophy wife to an old, what you would call a sugar daddy. And I mean old, like the dude's like 90, like on oxygen in a wheelchair, can't talk.
Think of that guy in the Pixar short who plays chess with himself.
Yeah, except a little older. And they have a trainer who is like one of the best trainers in the business, Christy Cummings, who's played by Jane Lynch. And of course, their story is both about retaining the crown and the clear attraction between the trophy wife and the trainer that develops over the course of the film, in a very, very funny, absurd way. And then, of course, last but not least, we have Scott Donlan and Stephen Van de Hoof, played by John Michael Higgins and Michael McKean, who are a gay couple with their Shih Tzu, Miss Agnes, and they are really proud of their dog, and they are flamboyant to the extreme, and they kind of have like a friendly rivalry with the rest of the the couples that is very, very fun to watch and see them throw shade at each other in this very entertaining manner. And of course, you have these really absurd announcers as well who cover the event. And everything is taken to this degree of absurdity that it's impossible to not find it funny. But at the same time, it doesn't follow like a set protagonist over the course of the film. It kind of zooms out to the competition as a whole and covers the whole, and it does like a character analysis of the competition and all of its absurd mock reality.
Yeah. And the other great thing about the characters is that basically each of the dogs is kind of a mirror of the personality of their owner. So, the Shih Tzus have the long hair and they're all like, done up in bows and very, I don't know, for lack of a better word, prissy looking. And then they have they're owned by the flamboyant gay couple, and the bloodhound who's like outside sniffing the ground and doing stuff is that very outdoorsy guy. And the streamlined greyhound who's very trim and neat fur is owned by the two who are obsessed with J. Crew catalogs. So you've got this.
Oh, they are obsessed with J. Crew catalogs. Right.
They met in a Starbucks.
Oh, man, that was really funny.
Yeah, so you've got this mirror between these animals and the handlers, and then you've got one of the announcers who is constantly asking, in a subtle way, he like keeps asking about the dog's consciousness. He's like, "Do you think they know what's on the line here? Do you think they know what's going on?" And so we're making these parallels between the dogs and the people who own them, and their insane investment in this competition, which has absolutely no like skill involved. It's all, as the announcer says at some point, is basically just a competition of grooming. And that's kind of what all these people are. It's just like different ways of presenting themselves that they're getting judged on. Yeah.
And in that sense, it is kind of like this really nice, subtle examination of how we present ourselves in the world, echoed through these dogs. But I really like to think of just how well set up this film is in terms of comedy, and how kind of simple and elegant the setup is, and how easy it is to replicate for those who would be interested in.
It's almost poetic in its stereotypicness, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, because it plays with the idea of stereotypes, but it takes them to such an extreme degree that
absurd level.
They stop being stereotypes. Like these aren't stock shelf characters. These aren't just set. Oh gosh, what's the word I'm thinking of? These aren't set tropes that you see over and over again. They might begin that way: the browbeaten husband, the trophy wife, the uptight couple, the gay couple. But they're all taken to these weird places because that's the idea of this comedy, that they kind of go beyond those tropes and make fun of those tropes.
Yeah. And the structure of the film, interestingly to me, felt the least. It felt the most staged out of the three movies that we watched this week, which didn't really bother me because it didn't really have this pretense of being an actual documentary. It just kind of had this documentary skin on it, if you will, just like in the presentation of the interviews and stuff like that. But it felt the least like there was actually someone just kind of dropped in on these situations. And maybe that's just because we were all over the place, and some of the dialogue felt a little more rehearsed, but it's still it falls into this category that we've just become very used to, of these mockumentaries that, everyone knows they're not actual documentaries, so they can have this luxury of being a little bit more rehearsed and a little more planned, but still with room for improvisation and a lot of these funny moments just once your actors have gotten into their characters and you put them all in a room together to interact. And then just use techniques like interview and handheld camera and stuff like that you don't really get if we were just doing this like a rom-com or something like that. You get a little bit more techniques if you put it in this kind of documentary persona.
And I think it echoes Christopher Guest's specific skill set very well. Like, he knows that he is not the kind of guy who can sit down and plan out a film the way the Coen brothers do or the way Alfred Hitchcock does. He knows how he works, and he steers into that turn really, really well in doing stuff like this, where he knows that if he gets a bunch of talented people, and I think you mentioned this, Jonathan, there are a bunch of wonderfully talented character actors in this film who are very good at portraying over-the-top personalities. If he gets all of those into the same place with a great concept that is absurd on the face of it and has the cameras, has the people, and in this case has the dogs, then he's set to make something wonderfully entertaining and funny. And I think nearly unintentionally, I feel like he stumbled upon it in this film, making the way that the presentation of human society. Every day, every minute, we make choices of how we present ourselves to the rest consciously.
Yeah, and the way we critique
that it becomes
each other.
funny. Yeah.
Because, in the end, tiny spoiler alert, but it really doesn't ruin any effect of watching it. The geeky guy with 2 left feet ends up walking his dog out there and winning first place. So totally the pun intended underdogs come out on top, and they just have this really dorky kind of suburban life that we catch up with later on. So it kind of does have that don't judge a book by its cover message going through this movie that is just built on these extremely over-the-top stereotypes of different people and breaking those down a little bit.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if this movie has the little interview segments happening while the credits are rolling. Because our other 2 movies do have that, and that's an interesting aspect that mockumentaries have an opportunity to have a lot of fun with.
I think this one finishes. I want to say this one finishes.
I think it just ends. Yeah. All right. So on to our last film, and a delightfully absurd film about vampires called What We Do in the Shadows from 2014. Written, directed, and starring Taika Waititi. This film is set in New Zealand, and it follows, 4 or 5 vampires living in this flat together in New Zealand. And so we have Taika Waititi's character, Viago, who is kind of our main character and guide. The film opens with this little disclaimer that there's this big ball for all the vampires and zombies and creatures like that that we're leading up to. So that's a big crucial point in the film that happens later on. But we start off just seeing their everyday life. It's very much a slice of life film for these vampires. And we establish the fact that the camera crew has been given full immunity by the vampires in order to get this footage. So Viago kind of walks us through and introduces us to all the characters. We learn later that Viago was, the way they describe him is an 18th century dandy that was bitten. And so he's very fastidious and very particular about lots of different things. Very antithetical to what you generally think about vampires. Whereas Vladislav, who's the next one that we meet, is much more of your stereotypical vampire. You see lots of like old drawings and stuff of an old tyrant like impaling people on spikes and stuff like that. And he has a torture chamber in the flat and all kinds of stuff like that. And then Deacon, who is younger than the others, he's only like 160 years old or something. He's what they call the young bad boy, and he doesn't do his job around the flat, and he's more sloppy, and they get angry with him some. But just watching all of their characters is really funny to see them interact. And then there's Peter, who is essentially Nosferatu, and he has... he's literally, I think they literally have a picture from Nosferatu in there when they're introducing his character. But he has a minor role, but he's very memorable. And then at some point they have a couple of young people over to eat them for dinner, and one of them ends up... So the way you become a vampire in this mythology of this movie is once you've been bitten by a vampire, if they offer you some blood and you drink it, then you become a vampire. And so that happens to this new guy named Nick. And so part of the movie is following...
Fucking Nick.
What?
I was just thinking about how funny the guy was.
Yeah, so part of the movie is following Nick's transition into a vampire. So he's kind of our connection with the movie, because it's like, what happens if a 21st century person gets turned into a vampire, and what does that transition look like? And then he brings a human friend named Stu, into the flat, and so there's just a lot of character dynamics going on. Again, a lot of these mockumentaries are all about character, because that's what documentaries are based on, is people and interesting people. And when you're doing a mockumentary, you get to create your own fictional personalities, and you just have so many opportunities for ridiculousness. So thrown into all of this leading up to this big ball that they're going to, we see interactions with werewolves and that rivalry, and you get to see like how they interact in the normal town, and what happens when the police come over, and all these different situations that keep happening, and how vampires are able to get away with being vampires in 21st century New Zealand. And again, just all of the characters are so funny, interacting, and you've got a lot of really good like effects and stuff. And it all has this cinema verite look to it, and it actually comes off really well.
Incredibly well shot, especially considering that most of it is like this it is one documentary style. So in theory, the cameramen don't know where the actors are going to go, except they have to in this case, because most of it is literally shot in the shadows. Like, it is incredibly dark, and a setup like Best in Show, you can play fast and loose with the blocking because, well, everything is pretty much in light. It's fairly even lighting. But in What We Do in the Shadows, they have this very dramatic, well-lit look to everything that's going on, which means the lighting's fairly high. That, it's really impressive that everything looks good throughout as the characters move.
Yeah, and the other element that goes into that in this film, which we have practically none of in either of the other films, is special effects. Because we're dealing with vampires that fly and turn into bats and cats and werewolves and stuff like that. And the effects are actually really well done. I assume this is not a huge budget film, but none of the effects take you out of the film at all. So there's no way that it is as improvised as some of the other films, but it feels very, very raw and in the moment. You have a lot of moments where characters are talking over each other, and the dialogue is just really, really perfect, whether it's improvised or not. It's so well done.
Oh, yeah, certainly. Of course, a lot of the focus in this film is on Taika Waititi because he's kind of breaking out when he does this. He's not the only director on this film. There is a second director, and it's not Flying Conchords, as I misspoke earlier, Fame, who is doing... they're both writing. They're both very creative people. And it does this whole work of world building for a pre-established world. Best in Show works off of a pre-established world and kind of fleshes it. We do have this mythology and legends of vampires that we follow, have its own rules to it to make it work. And What We Do in the Shadows fleshes those out very well. Somebody is turned into a vampire. It is done nearly in a very funny way.
Yeah, and I think they get some help from the fact that documentaries are, to a large extent, no matter what the end goal is, informative. Whether it's a documentary to entertain or specifically to inform or to influence, that idea of presenting information is built into them. So we get things like Taika Waititi's character explaining stuff to us, to the camera, because he can break that fourth wall, and we know that they know that there's a movie going on. So he'll say things like, we can't go out in sunlight or whatever, and so it kind of gets built in a way that doesn't feel expositional. It just feels like the characters acting as they would in a documentary setting, because when you have someone new coming into your setting, you want to kind of help them along and explain it to them, and we get the benefit of that as the audience, so that we're not having to kind of guess at, okay, so which iteration of vampire mythology are we going with, because they're going to step us through each part as we go along. It's not all like front loaded or anything. It's like there are certain things that are explained later on about werewolves.
I love the way, they're like all talking themselves through like this 12-step program of like.
Yeah, one of the things they always say is if one of them curses at the vampires or something, because the vampires are always trying to pick a fight, and they're like, "What are we? We're werewolves, not swearwolves." It's just one of the greatest lines.
Directly told to the camera, but out of necessity. So instead of is kind of hush hush because it's so personal to one of the vampires.
Yeah. And it's done like in a setting where it's like, okay, we took him aside out of the other context, and he's confiding this to the camera crew now that he's ready for it or whatever. So it all feels very natural and very much fits into this pre-existing language of documentary filmmaking that we're very used to already. And this film uses a couple other techniques that the others don't use as much. So, for example, when we're learning backstory about each of the vampires, we're being shown a lot of old historical photos of, Transylvanian tyrants and stuff like that from these different periods. So it goes into like this slightly Ken Burns-ish feel for a second, and then comes back because we're dealing with presumably very historic characters and events. And the other technique that this film uses at the end is the thing that's actually pretty popular, where you like take a voice message and use it as a voiceover to introduce a new scene, and that kind of sets up this little epilogue at the end of the film. Which I thought was just perfect because, they're making the whole thing up, but that technique has been used a lot in other real documentaries.
They all have the most absurd backstories that get revealed over the course of the film.
Yeah, it's this great. It's so interesting to see these two genres of this fake documentary, which is supposed to be like the closest to reality that we can present things or try to present things as documentary, and then mixing that with fantasy, which is the most non-fictional genre that we have, where we're literally making up things in mythology, and putting those two together, and just being able to live in that contradiction is just really funny.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting tension.
And that goes into this idea, shifting over into overall notes now, that in order to understand the humor of mockumentaries, you have to, A, have an understanding of the subject that the film is dealing with, and B, have a comedic anchor points to hold on to. So you have to see an element of the mockumentary and understand it as comedy or satire, and not as a truthful representation of something. So that's where people kind of got this hang up on This Is Spinal Tap, because it's presented so faithfully, so close to a real documentary, that if you don't have enough context in the real rock world, and you don't have enough context with the filmmaker, it's hard to see it as playing for jokes, playing for comedy, and critiquing and overemphasizing all of these elements of the real world, as opposed to just being part of the real world. So What We Do in the Shadows is a really easy one to grab onto, as long as you at least have a little bit of understanding of vampires, which is not difficult nowadays with, the rise of Twilight and stuff like that, which I'm sure led to the rise of this film in some way or another. They even reference it in the movie. And then Best in Show, again, has a little bit more of that staged feel, and a lot of the actors are fairly well known in other things, but still, you have to have some understanding of this kind of high class world of dog showmanship, and these kind of people who would take their animals so seriously, and just the way that their animals are judged on their appearance so seriously. So it's this interesting thing where you have to hit a couple of notes with mockumentaries in order for them to actually come off as such and not just be totally misunderstood.
Yeah, it doesn't have to do necessarily with mockumentary TV in proscenium staging. So think something like Seinfeld or Friends, where you have like a wide. Yes, this is just comedy television we're talking about. Tends to be fairly stationary, or if it moves very like Modern Family, where the camera moves very quickly. There's a lot of quick zoom, follows actors as they move around. Like the cameraman looks like there doesn't feel like a mockumentary in the same way that like The Office or mockumentary style to it at all, other than the camera work, which is very style or documentary style. The techniques that have evolved.
And I think the appeal of that, once we establish it as a genre within itself, within documentaries and stuff like that, and like we talked about in the documentary episode, once you get to the 60s and 70s and you can go a little bit more handheld with the cameras as cameras get smaller and lighter and audio equipment is more portable, the appeal of bringing that to television is that it's faster. It's just a lot faster to do things that aren't, like I Love Lucy or Seinfeld or something where you have sets that you're working in all the time and you can just like basically leave 3 cameras set up and every week just jump in and keep recording on them. But if you're moving around to a lot of different locations, it's a lot faster to just kind of have a camera and do this kind of handheld in the moment kind of a feel than scripting out and storyboarding and planning out Hitchcock style everything you're doing when you're trying to make a show that's going to run every week. And of course, now the industry is so established and we have a lot of shows that can run every week and be much more scripted and set up like that. But you can definitely see where for certain instances, it's just really easy to take that look and not take it out of context and just use it for logistics and tone rather than to be part of the mockumentary documentary genre.
A whole generation like The Office, which I feel like everybody knows The Office.
Right. Even if you haven't watched it, you know it. And I think The Office actually does a couple times break the fourth wall and actually interact with the documentary crew. But like you said, Parks and Rec doesn't do that, but they acknowledge it in the fact of breaking the fourth wall and staring straight at the camera in order to emphasize one character's emotional response to the other characters. And again, the interview setups and all that kind of thing.
Right. And it's just another piece of proof that the mockumentary genre is going to be around.
Yeah, and even in that same vein, mockumentaries are not necessarily relegated to visual medium because even The Onion did a quote-unquote mockumentary of podcasts like Serial with their one season of A Very Fatal Murder where they take the whole idea of creating a true crime podcast and they parody it in the same style, but again, all scripted and everything like that. So, the idea of taking this format and mocking it and homaging it to different levels, is very versatile. And I think it's interesting that the 3 movies that we watched today all kind of take the same approach to documentary, where you have the verite B-roll footage mixed with the aside interviews. But like we talked about in the documentary episode, there are a lot of different kinds of documentaries. There's straight verite, where you don't interview anybody and you just cut together different pieces of things that happen. You have the documentaries where you see the filmmaker, like in Grizzly Man, which we see in Spinal Tap. You have ones where you don't, like we saw in our other 2. And but for the most part, these 3 kind of follow the same format. But again, television has an outlet through things like Documentary Now, where they can do mockumentaries that target specific real documentaries and take on the style and the characters of those, exact documentaries and parody them in a much more specific way. And then, in order to get the comedy, you just have to have seen the actual documentary, and then you can be like, oh, hey, I recognize that, I know that, and then they put their twist on it, and that's where they get the humor from. And finally, the other way that that mockumentaries have kind of entered the mainstream over the past, again, 2 decades or so, is the idea of found footage, which may merit an episode at some point, but it's interesting to touch on here because almost all found footage movies are fictional and they're just presented in a way that is documentary-like in the fact that they pretend that the footage was actually shot and was real and was just found and then edited together and put on the big screen for some reason. But yeah, it's again, it's taking that idea of reality, but faking it and just trying to make it look like reality in some way or another, which has now become so well established that there's not even much pretense in that genre anymore.
Right. And it's still like a relatively new-ish genre, especially considering how much is built up around it lately, in the sense that we're going to probably get a lot, like a crap ton of content that is in the mockumentary genre over the next decade or so, especially considering that the new batch of content creators and filmmakers and TV show writers that are cropping up are all big fans of it, considering they grew up with stuff like The Office and Parks and Rec. So it'll be interesting to see, with all that activity, where the mockumentary genre turns to next. How does it develop? How does it change? How does it shift? And it's just one of those things that we will get to see, and hopefully we'll get to enjoy over the course of our lifetimes. And it's something that I'm certainly looking forward to.
Yeah, I think it's versatile enough that it can keep taking on new forms and won't make itself feel dull very, very soon. And now that
this isn't even my final form,
and now that it is so established and it kind of has its own language around it, you're right. It'll be interesting to see where it goes next, whether that's on TV or on the big screen or even online. We haven't even talked about different forms of mockumentary online that parody reality TV shows and all that kind of stuff.
But I think Jonathan, that we should to mockumentaries.
Yeah, I think we are ready to talk about what we are going to talk about in 2 weeks on our next episode. Drum roll, please, Alex.
Drum, roll.
Perfect. Next week is our final round of the Hepburns. Round 3 of our series about Katharine and Audrey Hepburn and movies that we like them in. And the movies that we have chosen for next time in the Katharine Hepburn corner is The African Queen from 1951, starring Katharine Hepburn, Humphrey Bogart, and directed by John Huston, which is not an inconsequential mix of talent. And then in the Audrey Hepburn corner, we have Charade from 1963, directed by Stanley Donen and starring Audrey Hepburn and Cary Grant. So it should be a lot of fun for our final Hepburn versus Hepburn episode. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode. If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel, and Alex is @AlexGaringer. And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com. If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about. We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Absurd in every sense of the word. It makes all of the characters absurd. It makes the...
Hello, you totally cut out on me.
Can you not hear me?
Alex?
Jonathan?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, this is going to be really awkward. Hello?
Hello, I could hear you, yes. Could you not hear me?
No, you totally cut out on me.
Okay, well, we'll just keep doing it this way.